Jonathan Roumie stood quietly in the first-class line, his simple attire standing out amid the luxury around him. A man eyed him with barely concealed disdain, his arrogance palpable. What happened next would leave every passenger on that flight stunned and forever change one life. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel, as we'll have another special tale for you tomorrow. Seattle's airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Conversations blended with the rumble of rolling suitcases. Amid the crowd, a man stood calmly in the first-class queue. That man was Jonathan Roumie. He wore a plaid shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots that looked like they'd seen countless journeys. A worn backpack slung over his shoulder gave him the air of a weary traveler. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that, he went unnoticed. But a closer look revealed something different, not in his clothes, but in the serenity he exuded. While others rushed and fretted, Jonathan stood tranquil, as if the frenzy couldn't touch him. He observed everything: a child's giggle, the tired glance of an airport worker. He paid no mind to the curious stares or the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers, clad in tailored suits or dripping with jewelry. Right behind him in line was Richard Langston, a successful businessman who was Jonathan's polar opposite. Richard wore a bespoke suit, polished shoes, and cologne that announced his presence. Every move he made was deliberate, as if he wanted the world to know he mattered. His eyes scanned the queue, and when they landed on Jonathan, a smirk curled his lips. "First class, huh?" Richard said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "You never know who'll show up here these days." Jonathan turned his gaze steady, offering a faint smile. "Yeah, the world's full of surprises." Richard's brow furrowed clearly, expecting a sharper reaction, something to confirm his assumptions about the man before him. But Jonathan stayed silent, as if the jab didn't faze him. Richard pressed further. "No offense, but you don't look like the type who flies like this," he said, chuckling. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." Boarding time arrived. The first-class line began to move, and Jonathan and Richard, without another word, stepped forward with tickets in hand. Richard strode confidently head high, while Jonathan maintained his unhurried pace, oblivious to the bustle. Inside the plane, the unexpected happened. Richard checked his ticket, looked up, and saw Jonathan settling into the seat next to his. "You've got to be kidding," Richard muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. He sat down, letting out a low laugh, as if the situation were a cosmic joke. "Of all the seats, it's this one." Jonathan glanced at him, still calm, and smiled slightly. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said politely. Richard crossed his arms, trying to mask his irritation. It wasn't just sitting next to Jonathan. It was the idea that the man he'd mocked was now sharing his exclusive space. He couldn't quite explain why, but Jonathan's presence unsettled him. As economy passengers boarded, Richard decided to strike up a conversation, not a friendly one. "So what do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer, but wanted confirmation. Jonathan, tucking his backpack under the seat, looked up and said simply, "I work in film." Richard raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, really? Commercials, small-time stuff?" Jonathan smiled, shaking his head. "Something like that." Richard laughed. "Interesting. I always find it odd, when people try to fit into places not meant for them, like first class, for instance." Jonathan met his gaze, his eyes calm but sharp. "I think everyone has their place," he said, "and sometimes it's right where they are." Richard smirked. "That's cute, kind of philosophical, but real life isn't that simple." Jonathan didn't reply immediately. He turned to the window as if the conversation were over. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned closer, his voice dropping, edged with malice. You might be sitting here, but some things money can't buy. Certain places don't really belong to certain people." The words carried a clear undertone, not just about class, but something deeper. Richard's eyes flicked to Jonathan's worn shirt, lingering on the small cross necklace at his throat. "I mean, folks like you with your religious mumbo-jumbo don't usually end up in places like this." Jonathan didn't respond with words. He simply looked at Richard, his expression blending patience with quiet resolve, conveying more than any retort could. Richard, seeing his provocation fall flat, leaned back in his seat, a smug smile playing on his lips. He thought he had the upper hand, but the truth was, things were only beginning. As the plane took off, in-flight service started. The flight attendant, a woman named Sarah, moved through first class with a tray of drinks. Richard called out, his voice brimming with confidence. "A glass of champagne, please. Something that matches this seat." Sarah nodded with a professional smile. When she reached Jonathan, he said softly, "Just water, thanks." Richard seized the moment. He glanced at Jonathan, smirking. "Water? Don't tell me you're wasting a first-class experience on water." Jonathan took the bottle from Sarah, replying calmly, "I'm good with this. Sometimes simple's enough." Richard narrowed his eyes as if dissecting the response, then shot back. "Sure, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone's cut out for the best life has to offer." Jonathan took a sip, saying nothing. The atmosphere in first class began to shift, and a few nearby passengers noticed Richard's barbed tone, their eyes quietly following the exchange. The plane had taken off its engines, humming steadily as it climbed through the clouds. Jonathan Roumie sat by the window, his water bottle resting on the tray table, his gaze quietly tracing the horizon. Across from him, Richard Langston lounged in his seat, the champagne glass in his hand, glinting under the cabin lights. The air between them was charged like a storm brewing on the edge of breaking. Richard, with his smug grin, believed he held the reins. He'd already thrown barbs at Jonathan's appearance, and Faith expecting to rattle the unassuming man. But Jonathan's calm was an impenetrable shield, and that only fueled Richard's unease. He resolved to escalate the confrontation, unaware that his next words would draw him into a battle he couldn't win. Richard took a sip of champagne, his eyes fixed on Jonathan. "You know," he began, his tone falsely casual but laced with intent, "life's a lot like flying first class. You grind, you earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it's like they just stumbled in here by dumb luck." He paused, waiting for a reaction. Jonathan set his water bottle down, turning to face Richard, his expression still serene, but now with a sharper edge. "Luck or hard work, we all land in the same place when the flight's over, don't we?" He said, his voice even but weighted. The response caught Richard off guard. He let out a forced chuckle, masking his discomfort. "I wouldn't say that," he said, raising his glass as if to underscore his status. "Some of us are just on a higher level. Not everyone gets the value of being here." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms, his gaze unwavering. "I think the value of being here," he said, gesturing to the seat, "isn't about what you've got, but how you treat others." The words landed like a dart, striking at Richard's pride. A few nearby passengers who'd been quietly watching nodded subtly, their eyes betraying approval. Richard sensed the shift in the cabin's mood. His smile stiffened, and he clung to his mocking tone. "Nice one, first-class philosophy," he said, trying to regain control. "Maybe you should start giving motivational talks." Jonathan offered a brief smile, turning back to the window, as if unwilling to prolong the sparring. But Richard wouldn't let it go. He leaned closer, his voice dropping, dripping with disdain. "Seriously, though, you think spouting platitudes about kindness or whatever makes you belong here? People like you with that—" He paused, his eyes flicking to the cross necklace at Jonathan's throat. "Outdated religious stuff don't usually fit in places like this." The comment was laced with prejudice, targeting not just Jonathan's appearance, but his faith. A few passengers frowned, their glances shifting from curiosity to unease. Sarah, the flight attendant serving a row behind, paused briefly as if considering intervention. But Jonathan remained unruffled. He met Richard's gaze, his eyes not angry but piercing, as if seeing straight through him. "Maybe," he said softly, "but I think a person's judged by how they treat others, not by what they flaunt." Richard snorted, trying to brush it off, but his confidence was waning. He took another sip of champagne, his eyes darting around the cabin, noticing a few passengers looking at him with disapproval. It irked him. He switched tactics, his voice now tinged with condescension. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude, but the world's competitive. If you don't show what you've got, people walk right over you. That's how it works." He leaned back as if he'd just laid down an unassailable truth. Jonathan shifted his expression, growing more serious. "Could be," he said, "but I've noticed the folks who talk loudest about what they have are often the emptiest inside." The words cut deep, precise, but not cruel. Richard froze, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He fiddled with his wedding ring as if searching for a comeback. "Empty," he laughed, but the sound was hollow. What are you on about? I've got everything I need. Everything I've got I earned. Jonathan watched him for a moment, as if weighing whether to press further. Then he said, his voice low but firm, I'm not saying you didn't earn it, but sometimes we get so caught up in showing off what we've done that we forget to look inside. Who are we without all that? The question hung in the air, a challenge that forced Richard to confront himself. An older passenger nearby turned his gaze appraising Richard. The cabin felt heavier, the exchange drawing more attention. Richard squirmed, his grin now a facade. We are what we build, he said, his voice rising slightly. Without it, we're nothing. Jonathan looked at him, his eyes not judgmental but full of understanding. I don't agree, he said. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not what we pile up. He touched his chest lightly and his words echoed through the cabin. A few passengers nodded, their eyes shifting to Richard with growing disapproval. Richard felt their stares. He crossed his arms, trying to hide his agitation, but his voice betrayed tension. Easy for you to say, he snapped, nearly raising his voice. You don't know me, don't know what I've been through to get here. Jonathan replied, his tone still calm but resolute. You're right, I don't know your story, but I don't need to know it to see that when someone's always shouting about their success, they're often hiding something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness. The words hit like a hammer, silencing Richard. His face flushed, his hand gripping the champagne glass tightly. He stood abruptly, knocking the glass to the floor, drawing every eye in the cabin. You think you're better than me? He shouted, his voice trembling with rage. Sitting there with your cheap little sayings, acting like you've cracked the code to life. You know nothing. The cabin fell silent, stunned by Richard's outburst. Sarah hurried over, trying to defuse the situation, but her eyes lingered on Jonathan, who sat unmoved, his calm unshaken. Jonathan waited for Richard to finish, then spoke, his voice firm yet gentle. I don't think I'm better than you. I just think sometimes we need to pause and ask what really matters. And Richard, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. The words were like a cool breeze, easing the cabin's tension. Richard, breathing heavily, felt the weight of Jonathan's gaze and slowly sank back into his seat, his eyes now mixed with confusion rather than anger. He turned away, avoiding the stares of Jonathan and the other passengers, but inside something was beginning to crack. Richard Langston sat rigid in his first-class seat, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the empty tray table before him. The shattered champagne glass lay at his feet, a small but telling reminder of his outburst. The cabin was hushed, the other passengers' gazes lingering, some with disapproval, others with curiosity. Jonathan Roumie, seated beside him, remained a picture of calm, his hands folded over the water bottle, his expression serene yet resolute. Richard's attempt to dominate the exchange had backfired, his barbed words about Jonathan's appearance and faith only exposing his own insecurity. But he wasn't ready to back down. His pride, bruised but intact, drove him to reclaim control, unaware that Jonathan's next words would force him to confront a truth he'd long avoided. Richard took a deep breath, forcing a smirk to mask his unease. You know what's funny, he said, his voice lower now but still edged with venom. People who have nothing to show for themselves always preach about humility and kindness. Ever notice that he leaned toward Jonathan, his tone daring him to respond? Jonathan turned, meeting Richard's gaze with a steady look that held no trace of anger. I've noticed, he said slowly, that sometimes the people who talk the loudest about what they've got are the ones who feel the least secure inside. The words were quiet but piercing, like a needle finding its mark. Richard's smirk faltered, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, passengers now openly watching the exchange. A woman in the row behind adjusted her glasses, her expression one of quiet admiration for Jonathan's poise. Richard, sensing the shift, tried to laugh it off. Secure. You don't know the first thing about me, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Everything I've got, I fought for. I don't need some preacher in a cheap shirt telling me how to live. Jonathan's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. I'm not preaching, he said. I'm just saying that sometimes the need to prove yourself comes from a deeper place. An inner struggle, maybe. He paused, his gaze unwavering. You don't have to shout about who you are, Richard. Who you are shows itself. The words landed heavily, and Richard's face twitched, a mix of anger and something else, something raw and unguarded. He fiddled with his wedding ring again. his movements restless, as if Jonathan's words were stirring something he'd buried deep. "That's rich," Richard said, his voice rising, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "You think you can sit there with your little cross and your water bottle and judge me? I've built a life most people only dream of." He gestured broadly, as if his suit and seat were proof of his worth, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. A man across the aisle, gray-haired and dressed in a simple sweater, shook his head slightly, his disapproval aimed at Richard. The cabin's mood had shifted entirely. Richard's arrogance, now a spotlight on his own flaws. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but every word carried weight. "I'm not judging you," he said, "but I've met people who thought success was all about what others saw. Deep down, they were just trying to fill a void." He gestured subtly to his chest. "Something missing right here." Richard's breath caught his eyes narrowing as if Jonathan had struck a nerve. For a moment he seemed on the verge of another outburst, but something held him back, perhaps the weight of the stairs around him, or the quiet power in Jonathan's words. "You don't know me," Richard said, his voice quieter now, almost defensive. He looked away, his hands clenching into fists. "You don't know what it takes to get here to stay here." Jonathan nodded as if acknowledging the truth in Richard's struggle. "Maybe I don't," he said, "but I know that when someone feels the need to put others down, it's not about them, it's about what's eating you inside." The words were gentle but unrelenting, and Richard's face flushed a mix of shame and defiance. The cabin was silent save for the soft hum of the engines. Sarah, the flight attendant, moved through the aisle collecting trays, but her eyes flicked toward the two men, sensing the intensity of the moment. A young couple a few rows back whispered to each other, their expressions showing respect for Jonathan's restraint. Richard, acutely aware of the attention, tried to regain his footing. "This is pointless," he muttered, forcing a laugh. "You're just spouting feel-good nonsense. The real world doesn't care about your kind of talk. It's about power status, what you can show." Jonathan tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "The real world's made of people, Richard," he said. "And in the end, how we treat them says more about us than anything we own." The simplicity of the statement resonated, and several passengers nodded their faces, reflecting agreement. Richard's eyes darted around, catching the disapproving glances, and his posture slumped slightly. He was losing ground, and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him stop. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you're so wise, don't you? Sitting there with your holier-than-thou act like you're above it all? People like you clinging to your faith, your cheap ideals, don't last in the real world." The jab at Jonathan's faith was deliberate, a last-ditch effort to provoke. A woman nearby gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Sarah paused mid-step, her professional smile fading, as she glanced at Jonathan, waiting for his response. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He looked at Richard, his eyes filled with a compassion that disarmed more than any argument could. "I don't think I'm above anyone," he said softly, "but I've learned that tearing others down doesn't build you up. It just leaves you lonelier." The words hung in the air, and Richard's face twitched as if they'd touched a wound he couldn't hide. Richard sank back in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. He wanted to lash out to reclaim his dominance, but the cabin's silent judgment held him in check. The passenger's eyes, once merely curious, now carried a weight that made him feel exposed. Jonathan turned back to the window, his calm unbroken, but his words lingered like ripples, spreading across still water. Richard stared at his hands, his mind racing, replaying every jab he'd thrown and every response Jonathan had given. For the first time, he felt the sting of his own words, and the cabin's quiet scrutiny only deepened his unease. The first-class cabin was thick with tension, the hum of the plane's engines a faint backdrop to the silent drama unfolding. Richard Langston sat slumped in his seat, his face flushed, his hands restless as he avoided the eyes of the passengers around him. His outburst had left him exposed, his attempts to belittle Jonathan Roumie's appearance, and Faith only highlighting his own fragility. Jonathan, still seated calmly beside him, gazed out the window. His water bottle untouched, his presence a quiet rebuke to Richard's arrogance. The other passengers, now fully invested, watched with a mix of anticipation and judgment, sensing that the exchange was far from over. Richard, desperate to salvage his pride, was about to push further, unaware that a single moment was about to unravel everything he thought he knew. Richard cleared his throat, forcing a strained smile as he turned to Jonathan. You know what your problem is, he said, his voice low but sharp, trying to regain control. You act like you're above it all with your little sayings and your saintly act. But it's just a front. People like you always hide behind that kind of talk because you've got nothing else. His words dripped with contempt, a final jab at Jonathan's faith and simplicity. A man in a nearby seat shifted uncomfortably, his wife whispering something disapproving. Sarah, the flight attendant, lingered nearby, her tray of drinks forgotten, as she monitored the situation. Jonathan turned slowly, his eyes meeting Richard's with a clarity that cut through the venom. I'm not hiding anything, he said, his voice steady but laced with conviction. But I've learned that putting others down doesn't make you stronger. It just shows what you're afraid of. The words were like a mirror reflecting Richard's insecurities back at him. His jaw tightened, and he leaned forward ready to fire back. But Jonathan continued, his tone gentle yet unyielding. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone, Richard. Not to me, not to them. He gestured subtly to the watching passengers and not to yourself. Richard's face reddened, his hands clenching into fists. Don't patronize me, he hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. You sit there acting like you've got life figured out, but you're nobody. Just some guy with a cheap necklace and a bunch of empty words. The attack on Jonathan's cross necklace drew a sharp intake of breath from a woman across the aisle, her eyes narrowing at Richard. The cabin's disapproval was palpable now, a collective weight pressing down on him. But Richard, blinded by his need to dominate, didn't notice. He was too focused on tearing Jonathan apart, oblivious to the storm he was inviting. Before Jonathan could respond, Sarah approached, her voice professional but firm. Gentlemen, is everything all right? She asked, her eyes flicking between them. Richard waved her off, his tone dismissive. We're fine, he snapped. Just having a conversation. Sarah hesitated, her gaze lingering on Jonathan, who nodded slightly as if to reassure her. She stepped back but stayed close, her presence a subtle warning. Jonathan looked at Richard, his expression unchanged, and said softly, I don't think I'm anybody special, but I know that trying to make others feel small doesn't fill the emptiness inside. The words struck deep, and Richard's eyes flickered with something beyond anger, vulnerability perhaps, or recognition. He opened his mouth to retort, but at that moment Sarah returned, her demeanor shifting to one of deference as she addressed Jonathan directly. Mr. Roumie, she said, her voice carrying through the cabin, the captain wanted me to confirm your connecting flight in Chicago is all set. He also sends his regards. The name Roumie echoed like a thunderclap. Passengers' heads turned, eyes widening as realization dawned. A murmur rippled through the cabin, and Richard froze, his face draining of color. Roumie? He whispered almost to himself, his voice barely audible. Jonathan Roumie. Jonathan nodded politely to Sarah, thanking her with a quiet smile, then turned to Richard, his expression unchanged. Is something wrong? He asked, a faint trace of amusement in his eyes. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. He glanced around, seeing the passengers' stares now fixed on him, some with curiosity, others with outright disdain. A young man a few rows back leaned forward, whispering to his partner, his eyes bright with recognition. Richard sank deeper into his seat, his earlier bravado crumbling. I didn't know, Richard stammered, his voice shaking. I mean, you didn't say who you were. He gestured weakly at Jonathan's plain clothes as if they were to blame for his mistake. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. I didn't think I needed to, he said. I don't usually lead with my name like it's a badge. The words were a quiet rebuke, and Richard flinched, his hands gripping the armrests. The cabin was silent, the passengers' attention unrelenting, their judgment, a heavy cloak around Richard's shoulders. Look, I didn't mean to offend you, Richard said, his tone desperate, now trying to backpedal. I just didn't know I was talking to… you. Jonathan's eyes held steady, unflinching. What you said doesn't change because you know my name now, he said. The truth doesn't depend on who you're talking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people. The words were a final blow to Richard's pride, and he shrank back, his face a mask of humiliation. The passengers' murmurs grew louder, some shaking their heads, others exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, his calm restored, but his words lingered, a challenge Richard couldn't escape. You know, Richard, he said, his voice softer, now life's tough enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to make others feel smaller just to feel bigger themselves. The statement resonated, and a few passengers nodded their expressions, softening toward Jonathan, hardening toward Richard. Richard stared at his hands, his mind a whirlwind of shame and denial, unable to meet the eyes of those around him. The cabin's scrutiny was unbearable, and he felt the weight of his own words crushing him. Sarah moved through the aisle again, her presence a reminder of the normalcy that had been shattered. The passengers' attention began to shift, but the tension between Jonathan and Richard remained a silent battle now fought in Richard's heart. He wanted to disappear, to rewind the flight and erase his arrogance, but there was no going back. Jonathan's identity, revealed so unexpectedly, had stripped away his defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. And as the plane continued its journey, Richard grappled with the dawning realization that he'd been wrong not just about Jonathan, but about himself. The plane droned on, slicing through the clouds toward Chicago, but the first-class cabin remained steeped in a heavy silence. Richard Langston sat hunched in his seat, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes avoiding the passengers whose gazes still lingered. The revelation of Jonathan Roumie's identity had stripped him bare, his arrogance exposed as a hollow facade. His jabs at Jonathan's appearance and faith laced with prejudice had turned the cabin against him, their disapproval a suffocating weight. Jonathan, serene as ever, sat beside him, his water bottle untouched, his presence a quiet testament to the power of humility. Richard's mind churned, replaying every cruel word, every smug glance, and the moment his world crumbled when Sarah uttered Jonathan's name. He was cornered not by Jonathan's words, but by his own actions, and the consequences were about to crash down with unrelenting force. Richard's throat tightened as he stole a glance at Jonathan, who was now reading a small book, its worn cover suggesting it was well-loved. The sight only deepened Richard's shame. Jonathan hadn't needed to flaunt his status, yet his quiet dignity had commanded respect Richard could only dream of. Desperate to salvage something, Richard cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to say something," he said, his eyes fixed on his hands. Jonathan closed his book, turning to him with a calm, attentive gaze. The cabin seemed to lean in, passengers sensing another pivotal moment. "I was wrong," Richard said, his voice cracking. "Not just because you're who you are, but because I acted like a fool. I shouldn't have said those things." His words were halting, raw, with a sincerity he hadn't shown before. He paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't mean to disrespect your faith or anything. I just—" He stopped, unable to articulate the tangle of pride and insecurity that had driven him. Jonathan nodded slightly, his expression gentle but unflinching. "I appreciate that," he said, "but an apology means more when it leads to change. I hope you figure out what really matters, Richard." The words were kind but pointed a call to action rather than absolution. Richard nodded, his face flushed with a mix of relief and lingering shame. He wanted to believe the apology would erase his mistakes, but the passengers' stares told a different story. A woman across the aisle whispered to her husband, her expression skeptical, as if Richard's words were too little too late. The older man in the sweater, who'd watched the entire exchange, shook his head, his disapproval unwavering. Richard felt their judgment like a physical weight, and for the first time he understood the cost of his arrogance. As the plane began its descent, Sarah approached with a professional smile, but her eyes were cooler when they met Richard's. "We'll be landing soon," she said, her tone neutral. She handed Jonathan a note, her voice softening. "From the captain, Mr. Roumie. He's a fan of your work." Jonathan thanked her, tucking the note away without reading it. The gesture was small but significant, a reminder of the respect Jonathan commanded effortlessly. Richard, watching, felt a pang of envy, not for Jonathan's fame, but for the authenticity he lacked. The plane touched down, and as passengers gathered their belongings, Richard's phone buzzed incessantly. He glanced at the screen, his face paling. Notifications flooded in texts, emails, and social media alerts. His heart sank as he opened a message from a colleague. "What's this about you picking a fight on a plane? It's all over X." Richard's hands trembled as he scrolled through posts from passengers who'd witnessed the exchange. One tweet, already gaining thousands of likes, read, "Just saw a guy humiliate himself trying to bully Jonathan Roumie in first class. Roumie's grace was unreal." kindness wins. Attached was a blurry photo of Richard mid-outburst, his face contorted with anger. Another post from a verified account was even more damning. Richard Langston, CEO of Langston Ventures, just showed the world how to tank a reputation in one flight. Disrespecting faith and decency doesn't fly. Kreger, Seattle to Chicago. Richard's stomach churned. His company's board was tagged in dozens of replies, some calling for his resignation. A major client had emailed canceling a deal worth millions, citing concerns about leadership character. The fallout was swift and merciless, his carefully curated image shattered in hours. He looked up, catching the eye of a passenger who'd posted one of the tweets. The man shook his head, turning away. Jonathan, unaware of the digital storm, stood to retrieve his backpack, his movements unhurried. A few passengers approached him, their voices low but warm, thanking him for his grace under pressure. One woman, clutching a scarf, said softly, "You reminded me why I still believe in kindness." Jonathan smiled, deflecting the praise with a humble nod. Richard watched his chest tight, realizing he'd never inspired such respect. As they disembarked, he trailed behind his phone, still buzzing with notifications that sealed his professional doom. At the gate, Jonathan was met by a small group of fans, their faces lighting up as they asked for photos. He obliged with patience, his smile genuine, no trace of the confrontation lingering. Richard stood frozen in the terminal, watching the scene unfold. His phone vibrated again, an urgent message from his board chair. "Emergency meeting tomorrow. Your conduct is unacceptable." The words blurred as Richard's eyes stung the reality of his downfall sinking in. He'd lost not just a deal or a title, but the illusion of superiority he'd clung to for years. Jonathan glanced back, catching Richard's eye for a brief moment. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a quiet hope, as if willing Richard to rise from his mistakes. Then he turned, disappearing into the crowd, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Richard remained rooted, his hands trembling as he clutched his phone. The terminal bustled around him, but he felt utterly alone, the weight of his choices crushing him. He thought of Jonathan's words, "Who are we without all that?" For the first time, Richard had no answer. Days later, the story of the flight dominated headlines. Richard's resignation from Langston Ventures was announced quietly, his name now synonymous with hubris. Social media lauded Jonathan not for his fame, but for his unwavering decency, his responses shared as a masterclass in grace. Richard, stripped of his empire, began a painful reckoning, haunted by the memory of a man who'd shown him a better way. For Jonathan, life went on unchanged. He returned to his work, his faith, his quiet life, leaving behind a lesson that echoed far beyond the cabin. True worth lies not in what you claim, but in how you lift others up. And for those who heard the story, it was a call to reflect. In a world quick to judge and divide, Jonathan's example shone bright, a reminder that kindness and humility are the truest measures of success. Richard's fall was a warning, his ruin a consequence of choices made in pride. As the tale spread, it sparked countless conversations, urging people to choose respect over scorn, to build bridges rather than walls, and to seek the strength that comes from lifting others, not tearing them down.